about analytics and specifically how to get the best use out of it and to actually differentiate the offering that you have. So maybe just to kick things off, I mean, we were having a nice discussion in the pre-show, mainly on, if we could start mainly with data ownership before we go into how you actually use it, right? Let's start with the basics. Who owns the data, the customer or the bank?
It's a great question, perhaps loaded as well. So I think, given my background, People.io, for those who don't perhaps know, is a platform that's designed to give people ownership of their data. And in fact, we're creating the visa of data that enables people to transact data from one place to another without losing the control or ownership of it. So I think when it comes to should a bank own a person's data or should the individual, from a legal point of view, there is one clear answer. Lots of people own the data. From the shop where the payment was taken, through to the bank who enabled the transfer of the money, to all of the different technology providers in the middle. Everyone has some stake in the claim to that data. I think from a kind of consumer proposition point of view, though, you have to ensure the individual feels like they have the control of it. Yeah. Because in the scenario that you want to do anything more than simply enable the transaction, that data has to go other places. And as soon as it goes other places, whether from a legal point of view, from a trust point of view, or for any other reason, the end consumer has to understand where it's going, why it's going there, the purpose that it will be used for, and that they're not going to suffer a disadvantage as a result of it.
Yeah, of course.
I think my view is quite simple on this. Banks, or as a matter of fact, any corporate which deals with customer data, they are the custodian of that data. Mm-hmm. That data actually belong to the customer. There is a consent that you need to take in case you would like to make an offering on top of that data. So, for me, it's a very simple answer. Okay. But it could be open to interpretation. There are loopholes. There are some consents which implicitly and in some cases explicitly customers give, which result in corporates making use of that data to create products, in some cases for all the good reasons, improving the level of service, etc. as well.
And I think that's actually where it gets really interesting, because a use of data today might be seen as innocuous and beneficial to the customer, but actually a simple repurposing of that data or the product that's resulted from it could be negative. And to use an out-of-industry example, if you were to take the insurance industry, you could have a health tech startup that uses medical data to detect kidney disease. And that could save millions of lives. But if an insurance company was the one to go and purchase that health tech business, they would then use it to discriminate against individuals to increase insurance premiums. And so the use of the data hasn't changed, but as soon as that model is trained, it no longer needs the historic data in order to create the benefit or the consequence that results from it.
So maybe Arun, just from yourself, from a bank's perspective, have you seen, let's say, the way that data is being, the expectations, let's say, around the data and how you manage it, are you seeing that actively being voiced by your customers today in the light of what's happened at Facebook and these others, for example?
I think banks are, I'll be very honest, they are more cautious about going in a very adventurous way, making use of that data. In fact, that is a trend which has to change because they have been, I think most of the bank, I should not say or name one bank, and I've worked in multiple, they've been sitting on the piles of that data. In fact, it's high time that some of that data actually should be used for improving the customer service. So I'll give you an example. Each and every call that you make to a call center, for any broken customer journey or improved customer journey or for a request, that is also data. That's generating the data. Yes. Now, look at the power of that data, that conversation that's happening. It can give you so much of cue about the signals in terms of how's the voice like, whether customer is happy, not happy, what are the different complaints we are getting, and is it coming only for one product or not. So far, banks been sitting on that data for years. And now they have realized that this is also one way of understanding customer behavior, predicting the need, and if possible, improving the customer journeys, which may have broken and may have forced the customer to actually call the call center. Otherwise, every information you can get on IVR or on the website or on the mobile channel. So my argument is the other way around, that some of the data which is already there, in fact, most of it has to be used. And of course, you have to undergo the GDPR and different other laws which are in the process as well.
I think with those use cases in the call center is a great example. I think it's GfK who actually put quite a lot of investment into the analysis of voice, because obviously market research and really understanding the truth behind the statement, etc. But there was some news in the UK in the last few weeks, I don't recall the publication it was in, around banks being able to effectively determine whether a person is in a state of mental distress or effectively close to having a breakdown based on spending patterns and calls to call centers. And then the argument back from the banks is it's not our responsibility to stop someone from having a breakdown or to detect that stuff. Rightly so, because a bank isn't a healthcare institution. But I think to that very same end, being able to detect a person's emotional state and their mood and how they are, we've seen how that can easily be misused by Facebook, who claim innocence in that process. And to some extent, I truly believe that the individuals or the engineers that were building that product didn't intend the way it was used for that case. But the reason I agree that from the point of view of analytics it's beneficial is because you can create better services. The question is, how do you ensure that the bank or the company that's providing that doesn't then also become the judge, jury, and arbiter of the output of it? And for so long as the data or the resulting intelligence that comes from the data is held and retained by the organization, it's very, very hard to create that control. So I think the execution and the product absolutely makes sense. It's just abstracting the kind of use case away from where it's created.
And I think on that point, I mean, if you look at banks traditionally, as Arun said, there's a lot of data that's actually stored. Some valuable, a lot maybe less valuable, but there's a lot, right? And I think yesterday I used an example in my talk that it's like the dragon from The Hobbit, Smaug. Banks have all this data, all this potential value, maybe, but they don't do anything with it today. So maybe to some of the audience here who are maybe struggling with some of those, where do you begin? Where do you actually begin? You have a massive data set, unstructured, structured.
Yeah.
Where do you begin?
I think it's a multi-million-dollar question, where to begin. That's very, very important. Now, one thing is for sure, just starting off with a technology in mind cannot be the starting point, and that's what people do. We have a lot of problem. Okay, let's adapt cloud-first strategy. Let's go to ML and AI. These things are important, but what is the question? What is the problem we are trying to solve? So I think if I may give a bit of structure to my answer, you have to figure out what is the burning area. What is the priority for your corporation? And there can only be one priority out of 5 which I'm going to be speaking about. Number 1, are you on an investment journey, means on a growth journey? That means, would you like to invest into something which can lead to more revenue, recognition, and generation? Now, if that's the case, you will go for data monetization kind of initiatives if data is what you want to bank on. The second is cost a main distractor for you in the bank or in the corporate? So you will go in for automation. That is a potential solution, or maybe rationalizing your data centers. That could be one solution. So solutions will follow the problem. The third could be, would you like to improve customer experience? Yeah. Fourth could be, you want to improve employee value proposition. Fifth, we are a bank. We are in the business of managing risk. So how I can improve my risk culture and different potential penalties that I might need to pay. So the investment goes accordingly. So figure out your use case. That is the first starting point. Brainstorming session, fusion exercise, and prioritize on 2 or 3 use cases you want to work on, and come out with a simple so-called minimum lovable offering scope.
Very good.
And accordingly go ahead and look for the solutions. And market is full of shiny tools, by the way.
So many shiny tools out there. I think also though, with where we're going from a consumer experience point of view, and I love that reference of like minimum lovable product as opposed to minimum viable product. But I think what's quite interesting is historically, over the last 15 years, products and services have existed that just create a wealth of data.
Yep.
And a lot of the time people talk about big data as actually the complexity of the volume of data that's created, and therefore how to create any minimum lovable or viable product as a result of that data. The barrier to entry is quite high because there's just so much data. But what I think we'll start to see over the next 2 to 5 years is actually a scarcity of data. And we've already seen an example of that, whether it's through GDPR or the future e-privacy, that creates a harder requirement in order to collect the data to start with. So from a regulatory point of view, we'll see that scarcity increase. But I think also from a consumer product adoption point of view as well, and if you were to take a website, if you include a tracker on a website, you can get a whole wealth of information from the user's location, to the devices they're using, to the browser, to all the different things they're looking at. You've got a huge amount of information. The same is true on mobile, albeit slightly less because obviously cookies and certain tracking technologies are harder to implement. But when you start to look at voice interfaces, how do you drop a cookie on Amazon Echo? You can't. How do you analyze the emotional sentiment of the individual? You can't, because Amazon is in the middle of it. And whether it's voice interfaces, whether it's kind of big screen out of home, like digital out of home that uses facial recognition, whether it's third-party services that are ubiquitous and simply identify the individual in a context to provide the service, none of those services are providing any additional metadata for you to analyze. And so what I think is quite interesting is a lot of businesses are spending, as you pointed out at the start, the multi-million-dollar question. Take Adobe, take Salesforce,
billion, I think it was, huh?
Take Oracle, those kind of 20, 30, 50, $100 million licenses for data management platforms that brands have invested so much money into and therefore are now desperately trying to hoover up data to populate to make the investment worth it. They all thrive on data. Yep. And as that data becomes more scarce, what are you then going to do?
Well, I mean, is this, let's say, a long-term play potentially for banks? Just wait it out and then start attacking, for example, the Facebooks, the Amazons, and everything, and deriving value? Or, yeah, how would you see that panning out in the next few years?
No, I think there has to be a balanced approach. You can't. I mean, banks cannot just be the laggards, and that's why what I have seen is there is active involvement and interest in terms of scouting around and seeing. The fintechs which might be solving that problem. So I think that's where banks are different. Mm-hmm. People often say that, it's difficult to work in a fintech. I actually differ. It's actually difficult to work in a bank which would like to move into an incubator mode, especially a bank with a lot of legacy. And that's a rare skill. Take my words. You have to deal with a lot of bureaucracy. You have to deal with a lot of so-called cultural mindset. Wherein you don't have $2 million, 6 months is minimum when you can expect something which you can at least see. This in journal I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So my view is the middle path, especially from the banking perspective, and banks been there for hundreds of years, is somewhere in between. Incubator mentality, you still have to manage the risk, etc. But then not investing into innovation and new technology is not an answer. Otherwise, what will happen is you will be swammed away by these disruptors which are transformational in nature.
I'd agree with that. And actually, my last comment about data scarcity, I should have probably capped it off with the fact that banks are one of the few industries that will continue to actually have lots of data because they're enabling transactions and seeing all of that for the purpose of providing the service. So whereas the newer, the startups in the space and perhaps a lot of the fintech startups, they're the thin layer that sits on top of an infrastructure that already exists, which in most cases will be an incumbent bank. So there is a huge opportunity for banks to play a big role in that, but as we've just pointed out, you've got to stay ahead as opposed to just sitting there and hoping that trust is the thing that keeps a bank alive.
Exactly, and if we look at, and please, audience, don't crucify me for saying Amazon or Uber or Netflix or anything like that. But if we look at, let's say, the Amazon model, they started off as a bookstore, right? Let's remember that. And gradually they realized that, we're starting to rack up more business, maybe we should be in e-commerce. We're starting to scale our infrastructure and we have spare capacity. Maybe we should start lending that out. Do you see the same happening with banks as, let's say, data arbiters or data custodians or however you see it, as a way of potentially being able to spin into new business models linked obviously to financial services as a way of differentiating in the future? What do you think?
Answer is absolutely yes. And I think that's the need of the hour. Can you create a product leveraging the data that you already have? Can you collaborate with the other financial institutions which might be in the same business, exchanging the data, whatever you can, and come out with mutually beneficial products? So I think open banking is one example wherein it's actually targeted towards customers, so that in a very open manner you are giving information about, obviously for the people who are giving the consent, that they would like to be receiving the competitive quotes, etc. So that's one thing. The second is, most of the banks, if you see, who come from legacy background, they're coming out and investing heavily, and we saw a few presentations early in the day as well, not just in UAE, but I think in UK, India, and other countries as well, coming out with different kind of digital proposition. They're trying to change the app. They're trying to be nimble. They're targeting a specific, customer segment, which is all, for me, is a byproduct of the innovation that's kind of going on and the disruptive forces which are pushing them to go that way. And I can tell you, RBS has recently launched Mimo as one, and this was in the press on 1st of April. Mimo is money in, money out. There can be any so-called abbreviation of it, but that's basically a nimble app for millennia population. It acts as a personal assistant, induce you to save, induce you to pay bills. You don't have to really bother about it. It's like your personal financial assistant. And I'm sure RBS is not the only bank. I saw Emirates, NBD, and different other banks like Live as an application. Everybody is doing it.
Yeah, I think especially with those new products and services, thinking outside the box of how payments will evolve is an important part of it. And already in the world of IoT, we've started to see machine to machine. And so when you start to think about that from the context of even something basic like white goods, if in 5 years' time the quality of your fridge isn't determined by how cold it keeps food, but by the quality of the algorithm that orders the food, all of the different components to enable that fridge to order the food need to exist, and that in part is going to be a payment system. And you as the individual, if your food is being ordered by a fridge, don't want to have to sit there and review a receipt before it makes the order. Otherwise it kind of loses the benefit of the system doing it for you. So when you get to that point, you need to really get to a stage from a data point of view where you're able to make determinations about whether a payment should be approved or declined, not just based on a historic spending pattern, but also data from across a person's life. And one of the areas we've certainly found to be quite interesting, we did some research with one of the brands you see on credit cards. I can't say which one, but one of the two. And what we found was that individuals at the moment have no idea the data even exists. So we invited users to connect one of their bank cards into our platform, because from a technical point of view, you can then take data back from that processor into our app. But users had no idea that data even existed. And so interestingly, they understood the bank had the data, but not the card company. So I think the role for a bank in this scenario is to become the trusted kind of holding point for financial data. And in Europe, we've seen PSD2 starting to enable that. But it needs to happen really quickly, because otherwise you're going to lose out to companies like Uber, who will give you $50 of free driving credit if you share your banking data with them. Yep. And that's what Uber is doing. Yep. Apple launching their banking service. I mean, all of these big 5, big 6 tech companies are going to own the beacon of financial data trust, which is a big issue, and certainly in the way I see it. But I think the opportunity for a bank to be innovating beyond and outside of the box needs that speed.
And on the topic of speed, right? Arun, you work in a bank. You worked for multiple banks, and I assume there's quite a few bankers also in the audience. How do you make sure that you are able to actually react, let's say, to the data that you're getting, so you don't have this stale data that's hours, days, weeks old, because that's garbage in, garbage out, right? How does that work in your world or in your experience?
Yeah, I think the short answer is banks or organizations, big corporate organizations, been running in a batch mode for years now. And now the time has come wherein if I'm, let's say, in a cinema hall and I'm buying a ticket using a particular bank's credit card, the good experience for me is, or excellent experience for me is, as soon as I've completed that transaction, I should get an adjacent deal that, if I buy popcorn, I'll get 15% discount. Now, it's only possible if my data is moving in near real-time manner, going through the risk analysis, and then a nudge notification can come to me in near real time, in this case, in less than 5 seconds. Only then, it's going to be a good experience. It can't just be the case that I'm getting that once movie is over and I'm already out of that mall. So, to cut the long story short, which means this batch mode of analyzing, putting things in enterprise warehouse, I think is good for regulatory reporting loads. But when it comes to customer experience, and banks are thinking about and are already implementing Kafka as a technology which is used by LinkedIn for near real-time access to data. And then if you have cloud setup, if you use Amazon, you can put it to Kinesis, etc. So technology can follow, but I think that's already happening. From the food chain of sourcing the data to the actual consumption of data, the latency has to improve. Then only you can give contextual, near real-time nudges to improve the customer experience, which for me is going to be a differentiator in the coming days.
And something I think we've certainly seen is, so the kind of idea behind People.io is that people connect in lots of different data sources and it creates this single API that unifies data from across their life. So for us, whereas with a bank you may have to bring together lots of different data or kind of take it from warehouses in order to see that transaction, we just have 4 or 5 places where we would be able to see the transaction occurring. Whether that's someone receiving an email receipt from Uber to say they've just got out of the Uber, knowing also where they've just come from and where they've gone to, whether it's the GPS that's had a dwell time in a certain location and therefore suggests there was a purchase made, whether it's the bank API to show that the transaction happened. There's any number of different locations for that to come from. And so for us, then being able to take an action as a result of that is quite simple. And we built recently a silly app called Music Magic, which kind of shows that off. It was project code name, but somehow it kind of stuck. But the idea is you can connect your People.io account, and based on the data in your profile, it'll generate a playlist. Sounds simple, but actually if we see that your GPS has just started moving at an increased rate and your accelerometer is moving, we know you're running. So if you've just started going for a run, you can hit create playlist on your Apple Watch and it'll generate a playlist based on who we know you to be and the fact you're going on a run without you ever doing anything else. So suddenly there's an immediate utility that's created by that unification of data. To build Music Magic took 3 days. Didn't take any data scientists, didn't take anyone with a huge amount of big data engineering. It took a junior developer 3 days to just plug into the Spotify API. Why? Because the data is already there. And so there is certainly a huge opportunity to be doing more than that. And I think in financial services, kind of accepting like the big projects internally are important, but also working in a more nimble way externally to kind of plug into the MLB or MLP, whatever it was.
Okay, so just to wrap things up, I think we've covered a bit about who owns the data, how we use it, how we monetize it, and how we actually bring it to market. Maybe Arun, if you could just begin with a closing statement, if we can, from your side.
Yeah, no, I know we are almost out of time. My closing statement is, again, I repeat the same thing. What is the question you're trying to solve?
Yeah.
Rather than starting off with, ML, AI, cloud, which may be answer to 70% of the problem, but prioritize those problems, and then I think that is the right way to innovate. Use business use case driven innovation or investment.
Perfect. And Nicholas?
I think for me, the big thing is the question around where's the data going to come from? For analytics, for the creation of products and services, the big question has to be where's the data and how are you actually starting to utilize it? And that the caution is really that don't just keep hoovering everything up. There's no point putting trackers everywhere and doing all of this stuff just so you have more data and then work out what you do with it. Go back to doing what the business is there to do. making more money, providing services that are within your industry or your expertise, and then think about, well, where can that data come from? And if the best place is for the individual to be the one to bring it to you, then that's the way it should be.
Perfect. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Audience, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A round of applause for our panelists, if you don't mind.